Ready to boost your video creations? Try Maxon Studio. Maxon Studio's got your back with a sleek dashboard that's like your own personal editing playground. We're talking dynamic capsules galore. Our capsules are designed to supercharge your content creation game inside After Effects. So say goodbye to staring at a blank screen wondering where to start. Maxon Studio hooks you up with pre-designed, customizable elements. The collection is always growing, from elegant motion graphics to seamless transitions, animated titles, and amazing effects. The best part is, you don't need to be a design wizard or spend hours tweaking every little detail, because user-friendly controls make it easy to tweak text, colors, and more to match your vibe. So, what are you waiting for? Start creating breathtaking videos today with Maxon Studio. Take it for a spin with our free 14-day trial. Level up your content now.
Hey everyone, how's it going? Happy Thursday. First of all, can I ask a quick question? In the chat, give me a quick hi and let me know if you can see me all okay and hear me all okay. Because as you know, I do a lot of these streams by myself. So yeah, it's great to know if it all sounds good. And thanks to everyone who is here live with us. Yeah, looking forward to doing a live stream. It's been a while, I feel like it's been a while, but I've got a few coming up. So yeah, hopefully we can make up for it for the rest of 2024. Cool. Thanks for letting me know. So hey to Chris, Abuza, Peto, Andreas, how's it going, guys? Nice to see you all. So for anyone who doesn't know me, hi, my name's Elly and I am a trainer at Maxon and I specialize in teaching people Cinema 4D and Redshift. And today the plan is, if you can't already tell by my screen, is to do a little bit of a simulation, show you how to do a deflate, inflate, and then sort of like a popping sim. So let me just play this just so you can see kind of the idea of what we're going to be making. Let me play it through. And then one more time, because it's really, really fast. Cool, yeah, so nice and simple. We just basically have this deflate effect going on, and then it inflates, and then it pops and explodes. And this came about because I was actually training a studio who asked how to do this effect. And so through sort of a bit of trial and error and a few sessions with Thanasis, so thanks to Thanasis, got to shout him out, figured out a way of creating quite a easy way of doing this that has a fair bit of control. So feel free to follow along. I'm actually going to do this on a sphere, just so everyone can follow along with it. You don't have to worry about creating a logo. But if you do want the project file, I'm just going to throw that in the chat. You can actually download it for free. It's the full one that you just saw there that also has like lighting and texturing on it. So yeah, feel free to have that, play around with it, or yeah, follow along. As always, if you have any questions for me, there's a chat. So we're on YouTube Live at the moment. So if you have any questions, then just throw those in there. I'll keep an eye on those while I'm also kind of looking at this screen here. So if you notice, I'll probably be going back and forth a little bit. Cool. So yeah, as I said, we're going to do this on a sphere. So again, nice and simple. We're going to create ourselves a sphere. And then we can just see our topology, because this is actually really important. I do a lot of live streams on simulation, and I talk a lot about topology or the segments. And the thing is, we like to work with even quads, or as even as we can get quad topology. So we can kind of see here, it kind of goes into a point. So we don't really have even topology here, but nicely in my sphere, I actually have a hexahedron option. So I can now just see we have some slightly more even topology. And then I might just make this a little bit smaller So we'll go with 30 centimeters, and then let's increase our segment so we have 64. So my reasons for this is Cinema 4D simulation system likes sort of between, like 0 to 100 centimeters in sizing. We can play around with that anyway. So I can show you how we can play around with that. But for now, we'll go with 30 centimeters. And my segments is just going to allow me to get more of that sort of like deflation and inflation effect. And it also means when we create that exploding effect, we have more points that we can tear from. So we'll have more like pieces of cloth. So yeah, try not go too high with your segments too early. But for now, this is good for performance and sort of like testing. So what we want to do is we're going to think of this in 3 different parts. So we want to create we want to create a deflate effect. So we want everything to deflate. We then want to inflate that, and then we want it to pop. So we're going to do this in 3 different stages, but you'll see it's really, really simple. So what we can do, let's just create like a plane, and this is going to work as our floor, and it's going to be our collider to catch my deflated sphere. So if I just pull this sphere up, we just want to make sure we don't want to have any intersections with the floor. So we can see in our 4 views, if we just like pull that up, I'm not overly fussed about there being a gap. Again, we might, like if you're doing this yourself and it's for an actual project, we take a little bit more time, but for the stream, sometimes I like to do things just quickly. So here we go. We have our sphere here, and we have our plane. So our plane is going to be our floor. So if I just right click, I'm going to make this a collider object. So under my simulation tags, we have a collider object. And then the way that we can create a sort of a deflate state is just by right clicking on our object. So this is the object that you want to have sort of like animated or part of this simulation. And we'll just type in cloth. And again, under our simulation tags, we have a cloth tag. So now already, let me just move my mic out of the way. So now already, if I play through my timeline, we can see we're basically getting a deflated state. So as soon as you press play, it then deflates. And what we can do, so there are a few things that are actually going to impact how this looks. And the main thing is our constraints in our cloth tag. So again, I can see I've got it highlighted. And under here, we have these different constraints. And again, in other live streams, I talk a lot about this. But basically, this controls the look of your simulation or of your animation. So our stretchiness, our bendiness, our friction, all of those are constraints on the different points. So again, our topology is important. So it's on the different points, and it's how much they're going to be able to bend and stretch and sort of like remain rigid or not rigid from one another. So again, they're a lot of fun to play around with. And so for this, what we're going to do is I'm just going to increase my bendiness a little bit more, just to allow a bit more of my points sort of being able to fold in from each other. And then my thickness is that collision distance from my points as well. So again, if we're getting really up close, a thickness of 1.5 centimeters, you may notice that it looks like there's a gap between our sort of like our points or our mesh. So sometimes it's a case of reducing that down to ensure that we don't have sort of like those gaps. So here we go. We have this sort of like deflating going on. And from here, what we can do is we could play around with a few different ways of how it looks. So we could actually animate the cloth on or off to on. And that is how you would then animate your deflate state happening later. But for me, I'm just going to have it start on frame 0. And what we can do, we could even add, we now have damping inside the cloth settings on each individual object. So previously, if I press Command or Control D, this is actually found inside of your simulation settings. But as you can see here, we actually have full control in the cloth tag of each individual object. And so this basically reduces the amount of kinetic energy. So effectively, it slows down our animation. So if I put this on 25, we'll see how this looks. So we've now sort of slowed that effect down. So again, lots of different fun things that you can play around with in simulation to control how this looks. But what I like to do is inside of my simulation settings, so again, Command D or Control D, and go into simulation and then scene, we have a few options here. Here is where you can reduce your gravity. You can change your scene scale. So at the moment, my object is 30 centimeters. So I may even want to match that. And this will allow my constraints to work more accurately based on the size of my object. So if you have really small objects, it's very likely that you'll want to come into here and reduce that scene scale to match your objects. But the one that I want to look at is this time scale. So at the moment, it's set to 1. If I set this to 0.5, it actually plays at half speed. So I actually reduced, so I've taken away the damping. So the damping isn't now having an effect. But you can see now, we actually have this slightly slower effect. And so it's a really nice, easy way of having that deflate effect. But actually, we can just play around with our time scale to make it happen slightly slower. And we could combine it with damping as well if we wanted to. Okay, so that's pretty much it for like creating a deflated object. We put our cloth tag on there, play around with some of our settings to ensure that we have the look that we want. I then chose to reduce the time scale so it happens slower. And then now we have that. So this is what we have. We have it coming down to here. So in the next stage, it's then how do we now effectively re-inflate this object? And so what we can do, back in my cloth tag, we have ballooning. So if you haven't played around with this, I would seriously recommend just playing around with some of the Cinema 4D simulation tools. They're a lot of fun. I use them on like a daily basis and I teach them quite a lot. Ballooning allows us to apply, if I go back, if I enable my ballooning, we have an overpressure value. And think of this as the amount of kind of like pressure and inflation that can take place on our object. So a value of 1 is going to keep its original size. It's sort of like its 100% size. A value of 2, it will double in size, etc., etc. And the expansion time is how much time it will take until it reaches that max of the overpressure. So what we can do here is we could actually apply maybe an overpressure of 5. So it's going to really kind of inflate. That's what we want. We want it to like really exaggeratingly inflate, and then we can explode it or make it pop. But the trouble is, as we can see, we no longer have that deflate going on. We only have that kind of that inflated ballooning. What we can do, we can actually set up 2 really simple keyframes. So this whole kind of animation relies on just some clever keyframing, but very, very minimal keyframing. As I said, I wanted it to be like a nice, simple way of creating this simulation. Nothing too wild. So if I just disable the balloon, we now have the deflate happening. And then this is where you then need to decide at what point do you then want the object to re-inflate. So for me, if I'm just sort of like playing this through, it deflates there. Let's say maybe at frame 45, I then want the inflation to happen. So let's give ourselves a little bit more more time in our timeline. So let's just do maybe 150 frames. So I've got 30 frames per second. So it's a 5-second animation now. On frame 44, I'm going to set a keyframe. So this little button here sets a keyframe while this is disabled. So I click that and you can see it's now added a keyframe here. I'm going to go ahead 1 frame. Then I'm going to enable it. I'm going to set another keyframe. So I now have my 2 keyframes. So now what I get is it deflates, then it inflates. So this is it, deflate and then inflate. And then what I might need to do, I might just match. I found matching the expansion time with the time that it happens works quite well, or maybe going a little bit past it. So something like that. So we have deflate and we have inflate. And so at the moment, I'm happy with how it looks. A couple of quick things I do want to mention. When it comes to inflating or ballooning this way inside of Cinema 4D, your object needs to be watertight. So unfortunately, it has to be, so imagine in the real world, sort of like an object that's watertight. It has no holes, it has no gaps, has no tearing. Otherwise, it won't be able to inflate. So bear that in mind with the objects that you are using or the mesh that you're using for this particular workflow. Okay, so we have our deflate and then we have our inflate. And now it's a case of creating our popping effect. And this is where things started to get a little bit tricky for me. So as we can see, you know, nice and quickly, we can actually create a object that deflates and then it inflates. But when it comes to then the popping, as I said, this is where it started to get a little bit tricky. So what we can do is we actually have, so let me hide away damping, sorry. We have a tearing option inside of our cloth tag. And this is really cool because it does exactly what it's titled. It allows our cloth to begin to tear. And let me just, you know what? Let me just enable it for you. I'm going to enable it, and I'm just going to sort of talk a little bit about it. Basically, what tearing, what it does and what it needs is when your mesh or your object, that is your cloth, begins to stretch. So this is where stretchiness, this value here, is important. As it begins to stretch, as it gets to a certain extent, which is defined by this percentage, so as it gets to this stretch percentage, the points will then let go and detach, and that is where our tearing will occur. So bear in mind, if you're working with cloth tearing, you need to have a stretch value, otherwise nothing will tear because we're not getting any stretch. And then once you do have a stretch value, so let's go to a value of 2, it's then going to take in consideration, okay, if it then stretches to 150% of its sizing, it's then going to release and it's then going to tear from that particular point. So I'm going to leave these just as their default for now, just so I can show you what happens. We no longer get our inflate happening. And it's actually not clear why that is, but what's actually happened is as it's deflated, the stretchiness has kicked in, and therefore the tear past of 150% has also kicked in. And so as it's deflating, it's actually torn. And therefore, because it's no longer watertight and it has these holes, we can no longer inflate our object. That's how it works. And so as you can imagine, it was driving me a little bit crazy. So what we can do is we can play around a little bit with our settings. Having more of a stretch value will allow it again to stretch more before it then tears, as we're changing this tear past. So if we just change this to 6, we can see again, we don't then get anything. And so let's play around with this tear past. So if I go lower, it won't be the right kind of effect that we're after because the tearing will happen sooner. So let's go maybe 200%. So now the points need to stretch to 200% before they'll then tear and before they'll then release themselves. Okay, so hopefully you can see we got a little bit of, it tried to inflate. So let's maybe go 250. And we go down. And then let's try maybe 300. So this is all just to show you how these settings work. So we did 300. So maybe let's do 350. Okay. So 350 is then the number where it's so high that it doesn't allow it to pop, doesn't allow it to tear. So maybe we go 325, find a balance. Okay, 335. This was my process in figuring out how this worked. But all of this is just, it's valuable stuff to be looking at. So again, I'm just playing around with these values to find that kind of like that sweet spot, because it is an approximation when we're looking at these settings. And some of it is a case of sort of guessing a little bit, but it's educational guesses. Okay, so I think 335 might have been the okay one. And again, I could play around with my stretchiness value as well to dial this in a bit more. Okay, I'm going to leave it like this for now, just because it still kind of represents what I'm hoping to show. So we have a stretch of 6. We have our cloth tearing of 333%. And we have our kind of like our deflate and our inflate. So what we have here is we have it deflating, we have it inflating, but it inflates so quickly that it then tears straight away. So this was the issue that I was having. So we can create, deflate, inflate, pop. This is effectively it. But in my head, I was sort of hoping, like if I imagine seeing this on, I don't know, like social media or on like some marketing campaign, I imagine seeing a little bit more of an exaggerated pop. And so for that, what we can do is we actually have to kind of create a secondary motion or a secondary force that then helps create a little bit more of an exaggerated popping. And for that, we can also then keyframe a few things. And one of those is defining when this pop then takes place. So if I just turn off my cloth tearing for now, and I sort of play this through, I then reckon around frame. So again, this is just me as like an artist looking at what I think is a good time that it would then pop once it's inflated. And so I reckon around 85 could be a good time to then allow this to pop. And so what we can do, again, with some clever keyframing, we can kind of fake the effect. Well, not fake the effect. We can tell it to happen at a certain time. So at frame 85, we're going to have my cloth tearing enabled. So you can see we can't actually keyframe cloth tearing. So we have to think like clever. How can we get around this? And so the way of getting around it is at frame 84, setting this to a very high value. So we keyframe at 1,000 because we know at 1,000% it absolutely is not going to tear. Well, unless it inflates loads, then go higher. And then at frame 85, we can then say, okay, let's now go to a really low value, like 110%. So now what should happen is it should deflate, and then at frame 45, it should then inflate, and at frame 85, it should then pop. Okay, so again, it actually looks better than how it did before because we're allowing it to inflate a bit more and then we're allowing it to pop. And so this could be fine. This could be, you could look at this and think, hey, I'm happy with this. And if so, cool. Thank you for being part of this. However, I looked at this and I thought, you know what? It would be fun to create an even more exaggerated effect. So I'm talking a pop, so like a really sort of like exaggerated pop, and we've got the cloth bits flying everywhere. That's sort of what I had in mind when I was playing around with this setting. And so what we can do is we can actually, like I said, create this secondary motion, this secondary force. So what's nice about this setup is it's procedural. So at any point we can change any of this stuff. We can change, define our keyframes, play with our constraints, play with our objects if we want to. This next setup, it requires something slightly less procedural. So it requires us to basically borrow the inflated state of our object. So you know what, let me just for my peace of mind, let me just save this, because we know how things can be sometimes. Cool, right, so I'm just going to play it through, and I'm going to pause it maybe about now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to current state to object this inflated state. So if I current state to object, I can actually delete my tags. We don't need any of these. And so now I have the sphere that gets deflated and inflated, and then this secondary version. So this one up here that we can see. And what I can do, if we just switch off my sphere for now, we have this one. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this as a pyro emitter. We're going to create an explosion, and then we're going to use that force, that pyro explosion force, to then add a secondary motion to our cloth once it's like torn. So the tearing is going to happen and the explosion is going to happen, and it's going to take those cloth pieces and it's going to make it look like a more exaggerated popping effect. And the reason that I'm using the inflated state is because we're going to add a pyro emitter to it. Therefore, the explosion is going to match more accurately the inflated object. And so at the moment, you're probably thinking it doesn't really matter at the moment because it's a sphere. So it's all kind of like round and spherical anyway. But in the original scene where we have the Adidas logo or any kind of logo or mesh, having the explosion begin in the volume of this object was really, really vital to have the explosion look like it matched the original kind of mesh. So that's the important thing. So I'm just going to make this a little bit smaller. So I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller than the original. And then we're going to have this, we're going to name this just Pyro Pop. And then we can right click and we can add in our simulation tags, we can add a pyro emitter. So now if we play this through, we can see we have fire, we have smoke, and we have fire. One thing I do want to quickly change is this emission type. I don't want it to be on the surface of my object. I actually want it to be created in the volume. So I just changed that emission type to volume, and now we'll see it's in the volume of that object. And believe it or not, we're actually going to switch off density. I'm going to switch off temperature. And so the way that we can create a pyro explosion inside of Cinema 4D using pyro is we get rid of density and we get rid of temperature. We add fuel, and then we ignite that fuel, and we add pressure, and we create an explosion. That's the way it works. So again, there's loads of settings in pyro. I'd recommend looking through like the Cineversity series that Thanasis did on pyro to learn more about it. This will be a case of really just looking at the small number of settings that we need to create a pyro explosion, and the ones that we need to then, dial in how we want it to look, which again is artist preference. So a lot of this stuff is kind of what I think looks nice, but feel free to, tweak and change this and make it your own if you follow along. So as we said, we have changed our emission type to volume. We've switched off density and we've switched off temperature. What we need now is we need to go into our fuel. We need to enable our fuel. And this is going to fill our object. If we set this to contingent, this will fill our object's volume with fuel. And then what we can do is we can then ignite the fuel and create our explosion. So let's set this to contingent solid. So again, filling our volume with fuel, which is important. And I'm not even worried about these yet. I'm not worried about these settings yet. Well, let's just leave them on the default, just for now. And as you press play, you can see nothing actually happens, which is fine. This is what we expected. Back into our project settings. So back into Command D, where we can then see our pyro project settings, we have a few different options, but what we're worried about is coming down to fuel combustion. So this setting here, we can see we have the fuel burning rate, we have the ignition temperature, density per fuel, all of our lovely little fuel settings. And the important one is this one here, ignition temperature. So what this means is when our simulation temperature reaches this value, fuel will then be ignited. But the thing is, we remove temperature and density, so we don't actually have anything that's heating up our sim. So we can kind of do a little hack here. We can set it to -1, and then what it means is instantly our fuel will then ignite, and then we'll have our simulation. So if we play this, now we can see we kind of have something. So let's kind of move out a little bit just so we can see a little bit more of this like weird little blob. So we have that, it explodes up, and this is sort of what we do. But we want to make it look a little bit more like an explosion. So that comes down to our pressure per fuel. So we can enter a higher value, so we get more pressure. So you can see that kind of that burst out a little bit more because we had more pressure. And then the only other thing that we need to change is that initial contingent. So if we increase this, as far as I know it, it's kind of more fuel that you have. So if we have more fuel and we ignite more fuel, it will then explode more. That's kind of the way that I think about it, and that's the way that I look at it. So let's go high. Let's go 5. Okay, so we are seeing that we are getting a little bit more of this effect going on. So maybe let's go back down to 2. Okay, so we have this explosion going on, but then the trouble is here is we get this big cloud, and then it sort of like goes up based on gravity and heat and temperature as if a normal smoke explosion cloud would. But the thing is here, and what we need to remember is we're using this to add and create that second exploding motion. So at the moment, if we combine everything together, my cloth pieces, my torn pieces are going to explode out and then continue to float up into the sky with the rest of my pyro explosion. So we need to think, okay, so we need the explosion to happen. We need to have a big explosion, but we then want it to almost instantly kind of disappear or fade out. And we can do that with dissipation inside of pyro. So yeah, dissipation, effectively, we can then do that kind of that disappearing and like fading out effect. And so it's going to appear, it's going to explode, and it's going to go whoop really quickly. And whoop is the technical term, apparently. So let's go back to our project settings. So Command D. So every time I go into this menu here, I'm just pressing Command D because I'm on a Mac, Control D if you're on a PC. So in here, we have our density and our temperature, and we have our dissipation settings. And again, so basically the way that the values work, the higher the values, the higher the percentage, the faster it will dissipate, disappear, fade, however you want to kind of learn that term. That's sort of what it's doing. So again, this is down to you as a creator at this point, thinking, how do you want your explosion to look? I'm just showing you the things that you need to use. But yeah, these are sort of the settings I ended with, sort of like roughly 50%. And I think we kind of could do something similar. So dissipation of 50 and 0.1, again, it's going to make it fade out faster. And then again for the temperature. And so now we have, that is the effect that we've created. So really nice and simple explosion. So all that was, if we want to kind of like go back through that really quickly, no temperature, no density, but we do have fuel. And so if you want to have a bigger explosion, increase the initial contingent. So maybe we can go to 3. And then in our project settings, we then had our ignition temperature to a negative value and increase that pressure per fuel, and then increase the dissipation. And then we get this kind of explosion taking place. Okay. So at the moment, if I bring back my sphere, we're not really getting the effect that we're after. And so what we can do is I'm actually going to hide my pyro. So we don't need to see the pyro. So I can switch off the draw and I can actually hide that current state because that isn't important yet. We don't really want to worry about that. And so if I press play, we can see it actually isn't doing anything. So at the moment, our pyro isn't having an effect. We're just getting that same sort of like popping animation. And so what we can do, again, in our pyro settings, a fluid force factor. What this does is it effectively says, okay, now can we have pyro please impact and affect all the other simulated objects in my scene? This is the benefit of working with a unified simulation system. We have cloth, balloon, and pyro all able to work together. So I'm going to put a value of 1 in here, and I'm going to press play. Okay, so straight away, we have our pyro kick in, but we can see it's now having an effect. So we can see it's working. The trick is now to, again, do some 2 clever keyframes, just like we did before, and tell pyro when we want you to then explode. And what we want is we want it to explode the same time as our cloth tearing kicks in. So what we can do is if we click this little button here, this is our dope sheet, and it's a really great way of seeing our keyframes and the things that are keyframed in our scene. So we can see here we have our cloth and we have our different keyframes in here. And what we can do is in my pyro emitter, we just want to keyframe or animate the fuel enabled. And so we're going to match the same keyframes here. So we can see 84 and 85. That's when that cloth tearing kicks in. So let's do the same thing. Let's have our fuel disabled and then enabled. So now what's going to happen is the deflate is going to happen, the inflate is going to happen. Then at the moment my cloth tearing kicks in and it pops, my pyro explosion is also going to happen and take place. So let's just get rid of that and then let's see how this looks. There we go. So we can see that this is now giving us that exaggerated popping effect. But I'm not too keen on it. So maybe what's nice about this setup is I can actually come in and I can continue to play around with these settings. So maybe I want to set my initial contingent to lower because I can see it's exploding, but then it's kind of like floating around, whereas I want it to explode and then fall to the ground. Sort of, I would say like it would in the real world, but I mean, we're a little bit out of the real world now, but I want it to explode and then sort of come down and land. So yes, we change that initial contingent and then let's just reduce that pressure per fuel a little bit. So we're getting a slightly smaller pyro explosion. And remember, at any point you can come in and you can redraw the pyro so you can see how it's actually looking. That might help in the viewport. There we go. Okay, so we're getting closer. We're getting closer. If you're happy with how it looks, then cool. But there's always extra little things that we can do, which is nice about this setup because it's semi-procedural. So we still have access to a lot of things that we can change and we can tweak as a creative person to find a look that we're really happy with. And so what we can do, let me just save that, is if we think there's sort of too many of these pieces. So let me explode. So if we think there's too many of these pieces, this is where we can come into our tear past and our tear guide. So tear guide is it kind of looks to help you control the way in which the tearing happens. So if I set this to a value of 90, so it goes from 0 to 90 degrees, and I play it through, you'll see sort of what these values do. So it almost splits every single individual sort of quad or piece of topology up versus a value of, let's say, 1. It then sort of tries to hold those pieces together more, as would maybe a tear as like a higher tear pass. So remember, we looked at this earlier. So the higher we go, the more stretch will be allowed to happen before the points then release and tear. So if we look, so yeah, we can see we get a few more pieces sort of being held on together. And so, as I said, this is where it kind of comes down to you as a creative being like, okay, what do I now want to change, or what do I need to change to really dial in the look of this animation or simulation so it does exactly what you want it to do? And again, a lot of it is a little bit sort of educational guessing and a little bit of approximations. That's sort of the way we have to work with simulation. So from here, what can we do? Well, at the moment, as this kind of explodes, it looks great, but we get some extra little kind of like slow movement and sort of like floating in the air. And this is actually down to, remember at the almost the very beginning, we looked at this time scale. And so this time scale we've used to create a slightly slower deflate and inflate. And what we can do is we can do the opposite now. We can actually almost put it back to 1 or speed it up to make the explosion happen faster and then be more exaggerated. So again, I'm just going to come into my dope sheet. And what I can do is I could then say, okay, maybe just past where the explosion happens and the tearing happens, let's set this timescale from 0.5, go ahead 1 keyframe, and then set it to a value of 1. So it's just past it. I found when it happened at the exact same time, I got some small issues. It didn't really, the explosion wasn't able to kick in properly. So whether that's just something that has to be done, but I found, yeah, moving it 1 frame, so whether it's 1 frame back or 1 frame forwards, so it's not all happening at the same time, worked a little bit better for me. Cool. So yeah, we can see how that then, this little bit that was sort of like hanging is now getting up and pulling back down, and it just looks a little bit better. Okay. So again, so this is pretty much the end of it. The only extra stuff that we can look at is for any kind of simulation that you're looking at, you know, like cloth, or we're looking at like ballooning and tearing. If we go up close to our geometry, we can see that it's actually just like a single plane. And so for this, what we can do is we can actually add some thickness on top of here. And so inside of my generators, we can take the thicken, and we can put our sphere into our thicken, and we can see it goes a little bit wild. And so let's do a value of 0.2. So we have this like thin geometry. And then we could even put it into a subdivision surface. So then we have more accurate sort of, or smoother cloth. And remember, at any point you can do this in Redshift by adding the Redshift object tag. So if you add the Redshift object tag, we can do enable tessellation. So this is subdivisions at render time. Again, a nice way of doing this, because it then doesn't happen in the viewport or on the geometry. It's happening at render time, so it doesn't affect performance. But let's see, like, let's just see how this looks. So really, it actually is quite a cool, fun effect with still so much control. So remember, at any point you could now go in and you could play around with your cloth settings, your stretch settings, your tearing. You can go in and you can play around with the pyro explosion, which again will have an effect. So it's a very, interesting sort of like fun effect that to come out with. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to take a quick look. So I haven't really been looking at if we had any questions. So if you do have any questions, then let me know. We've still got like a little bit of time. So there's one question here. Let me take a quick look. So again, no promises that I'll be able to answer these, but I will do my best. So from Daniel, a few questions. What's the difference between gravity and bullet and in simulation? So what Daniel's referring to is when we right click in our tags, we actually have two different sort of types of dynamics systems. We have bullet, which is the legacy system, which doesn't work in the same way as the unified simulation. You can't have these things work together. And simulation is our new or newer unified simulation system, which is particle based. So it is more accurate, it's better with performance. And the big benefit is these all work together in the same scene. And so gravity as a force will be having an effect on your simulation. So you wouldn't be able to have a bullet sim and a simulation sim work together. So just remember that gravity works for bullet simulations in the same way that it does for simulation. So we can either enable it or disable it, and it works as a force, just like the rest of our forces do. And what's the difference between rigid body collision object as bullet tag and simulation tag? So again, just sort of what we talked about. If you are using bullet rigid bodies or soft bodies, and there are still some sort of possibilities in the bullet system that haven't moved over to the unified simulation system, which is why they're still in here. They're still possible to use. If you are using the bullet system, you need to make sure you're using the collider in the bullet system. So you can see here, this one's in here. If you are using anything in the simulation system, you need to make sure you're using the collider for that. So that's why we have two different colliders for the two different types of simulations that you're doing. Hopefully that helps, and hopefully that answers that question for you. So I had a quick question from VFX Nation, but I think it's to do with Arnold. So unfortunately, I'm very much a Redshift trainer. I have not used Arnold, sadly. I would say if it is similar to the Redshift scatter object. So again, we have in here, we have the matrix scatter, which I imagine is probably the same kind of thing. For weak GPUs, so obviously having not the best performing machine is going to affect your performance with like rendering or any 3D software, not just C4D, not just Redshift, like across the board. The differences are with the scatter objects is everything is then rendered at render time. But again, this still will be requiring a relatively good GPU or amount of RAM or memory. Versus the cloner. So the cloner, again, we have three different modes in our cloner. So we have instance mode, which is a 100% copy of whatever you're cloning, the same amount of memory, same amount of power, data, etc. We then have render instances, which is something that is being rendered at render time, but again, can still be relatively slow if we get to really high numbers. The multi-instance is great for really high numbers, but the downside to this is it doesn't work with things like simulation and dynamics. So all of these things you can use. If you're looking at, you need to kind of figure out what it is that you're trying to do. So if you're trying to maybe create a forest with like thousands of trees, it's probably better to go with the matrix scatter and then for your case, the Arnold scatter. And then in here, you should be able to add custom objects, and you can throw in all your trees that way. But you could also try the multi-instance as long as you're not animating. So yeah, hopefully that helps. Sorry, I'm not very familiar with Arnold, but if it's the same as Redshift, hopefully that answer helps. Let me take a quick look, see if there are more. So yeah, so Thomas makes a really good point, actually, something that I didn't talk about using a vertex map. And so yes, what you can do in your cloth tag, in this tear pass, what we can do is we can actually apply a vertex map. And then what it does is it looks at the vertex weight, and then the tearing can happen based on that vertex weight. And so a really cool way of looking at that actually is if we go into the show help, you can see, yeah, if you never use the show help, by the way, it's a great way to kind of like learn things. I use it honestly on a daily basis. And it's really nice. It's being rewritten, so it's very artist friendly. It comes with nice pictures, which if you're like me and you're a visual learner, it's great to see. So you can see here, we can create and we can draw a vertex map or paint a vertex map. And then effectively what it does is it takes this weight value. So where we have this 100% weight, which is the yellow area, it then tears based on that. So we could even create like a more detailed tearing. So yes, definitely Thompson. So I think I might have called you Thomas. So yeah, Thompson X with the vertex maps, it's very cool. Cool. So I don't think there are any other questions. So Make was wondering about using a GPU with standard renderer. I don't think so. I think, yeah, it's Redshift that is a GPU render. I think the other sort of like the standard renderers are CPU based. I'm not too familiar with them. I don't tend to use them now. Redshift comes included inside of Cinema 4D. So there are no excuses now. I can just help you all learn it. That's what I'm here for. So yeah, again, really quickly, let me just throw in that project file just for everyone that came a little bit later. So feel free to download that project file. I'm just throwing it in the chat. And that is this. So this final scene. So it's not the sphere, it's actually this like lit and textured one. Let me just play it through for anyone that joined a little bit later. So that's the project file that you have in there. So yeah, enjoy that, enjoy breaking it down. And one final quick thing is, let me just go to this link here. And we always love to say thanks for joining our live streams. So as I said, it's been a while since I've done a live stream, but I'm back. I'm doing some more. I'm doing quite a lot actually in 2024. So feel free to click that link, look at all of these like great links that we have. If you want to see what's going on, is you can go on to Maxon events. And so you can see all the live streams and the, in-person real life events that we have going on. So next week we have Lionel doing the 4th part of his simulation and rendering series. I'm doing another live stream next week where we look at like really easy 3D typography. So someone said on my Instagram, how can we bring our Illustrator stuff into Cinema 4D and make like cool content? So here we go. We're going to be doing that. And of course, the lads are doing VFX and Chill on Friday. And then we have a very special guest, Jess Hewitt. So I had to shout her out. If you saw the new release video and you saw all these like really great looking animations, they were made by her. And so she's agreed to come on Wednesdays in November. And I'm going to be there hosting with her. And she's going to basically teach us how to make this cool stuff with beautiful texturing in motion. So you definitely want to be a part of that. And again, if you want to grab a free t-shirt, just click that on there. And then, as always, these sessions, every single one of our live streams gets recorded and it gets uploaded onto the training team YouTube channel. So we host on Maxon and the Maxon training team. So bear in mind, if you're looking to rewatch it, then just head over to the Maxon training team YouTube channel, which is this lovely one here. So before I wrap up really quickly, we had one more question that I do want to answer. So Flacast, when talking about balloons, should we increase the simulation substeps to smooth it out? So that is referring to, in our project settings, our simulation substeps. So when you say smooth it out, if you want to smooth out the geometry, that will be subdividing. But if you want to smooth out your simulation, what substeps will do is it increases the accuracy, but also the rigidity. So what you can do to create some more smoothing and sort of prevent jittering, we can actually increase our smoothing iterations. And then remember, if you have any collisions sort of occurring, you can play around with your collision settings as well. So let me take a quick look through. One quick question. Oh, sorry, Blake Anderson. I say one quick question. The chances are if there's more questions, I will be answering them. Blake, no, as of the new release, Cinema 4D on its own now comes with Redshift GPU included. So if you get a sub now of Cinema 4D, you get Redshift GPU, which is very cool. So no, you don't have to have Maxon 1. Cool, right. So I think that's all of them. As always, though, if you have any questions for me, feel free to DM me on Instagram. Let me just go through this up. Just in case anyone does have like a few more questions, or you see like some project files, or you have live stream suggestions, I'm all for that at the moment. Then feel free to, just drop me a message on there. Yeah, I'm relatively active. So as I said, any questions on anything, if you want to learn something new, then yeah, just drop me a message on there. So yeah, thanks again to everyone who watched live. Thank you to anyone who is watching the recording on YouTube. Yeah, and I will see you next week for some more live streams. Have a great week, everyone, and I will see you soon. Bye.